Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Lisa Coleman, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation here at NYU, and I use she and her pronouns. I hope that everyone is taking good care. We're thrilled to welcome you to our Transformation Talks, where we spotlight leaders to learn from their journeys and gain knowledge about how to be agents working toward transformational change across our organizations. In OGI, we engage global diversity inclusion principles with an intersectional focus on nimbleness, inclusivity, resilience, transformation, growth mindsets, design thinking, and adaptivity in all of our work. Transformation Talks is part of NYU's Be Together initiative, centered on innovating, transforming, and most importantly, acting together. Today, we have the distinct honor of welcoming my boss, NYU President Andrew Hamilton. Andy Hamilton is the 16th president of New York University. He served as the vice chancellor of Oxford University, the university's senior officer, after an academic career that took him from Princeton to the University of Pittsburgh and then to Yale, where he was named provost. A distinguished chemist and a fellow of the Royal Society, Dr. Hamilton's scholarly work lies at the intersection of organic and biologic chemistry. He received his PhD from Cambridge University, his master's degree from the University of British Columbia, and his undergraduate degree from Exeter University. Under President Hamilton's leadership, NYU has made significant advances. Applications from first-year admission have increased by 40%. And this fall, the university welcomed the most selective and the most diverse first-year class in its history. Since President Hamilton's arrival, NYU has increased its research expenditures at a rate higher than any other US college or university. It has reached all-time highs in rankings of both national and international universities. And at the same time, President Hamilton has put into place the lowest year-to-year increase in cost of attendance in 2 decades in support of making NYU more affordable and accessible. And on a personal note, without Dr. Hamilton, I would not be at NYU, and it is a pleasure, an absolute pleasure to work with him and to call him not only my boss, but a colleague and a great support in this work. Hello, Andy. It's great to have you with us today.
Lisa, hello to you, and thank you for inviting me, for having me on. This is going to be a different kind of conversation from the sort that I'm normally involved in. So it's a great pleasure to be here.
Exactly. Well, we're excited. And so I'll just jump right in and begin with one of our favorite questions for leaders. One of the things that I love about higher education, and you know this about me, we love this intergenerational collaboration and engagement. And a friend of mine asks, what would your 8-year-old self think of you today?
My 8-year-old, I have a hard time even remembering my 8-year-old self.
Me too, sometimes.
Just before I get on to that, you made a wonderful comment there about the generational dimension of higher education. I have a very good friend who's the president of a university in Turkey, and he often talks about universities being an encounter between generations, a communication, one generation talking with another generation, a younger generation. And I think there's something very profound about that. And it gives us a reminder of also, of course, the passing of generations, that we all have our time and then we hand over to the next generation and the one coming up, and that's the way the world advances. It's the way the world improves. But you asked me about my 8-year-old self. Well, that was 1960. I was 8 years old in a very sort of bleak and slightly forlorn UK. The war hadn't been that many years before. When I was born, food rationing was still going on. It had stopped by 1960. But I think, like many of us, I suspect, I had absolutely no idea what life would hold for me. I didn't even have a particular interest in my academic subject, which was chemistry. That came much later in life. And I think all I was concerned about was playing soccer, football, as I used to call it in those days, and I was sports mad then, and I'm still sports mad. I suppose, you know, when I was 8 years old, I did something perhaps that's now become a metaphor for my life. I did something really stupid. I climbed a tree in my parents' backyard. It was an apple tree. So, you know, what's that? That's reaching for new goals, doing new things, climbing to the higher branch. What did John Sexton used to play? Play out the next octave. You know, well, I'm more physical than that, and it was climbing higher in the apple tree, and then I fell out, and I actually hit the ground incredibly hard. I still have a huge scar, which can remind me of this moment every time I lift my pant leg. And I spent 2 weeks in hospital, you know, recovering. But it's a reminder, you know, metaphor for life. You know, yes, always try to reach higher, always try to do new things, but be ready for the bumps. Be ready for the downsides of life and the challenges that can be presented. And, you know, in my academic career, you listed it as if it was this kind of inevitable, relentless, you know, march forward. It truly wasn't, Lisa. And, you know, I talked about this very much in my first graduation speech at NYU. I had a huge bump in my career early on. I was an assistant professor at Princeton, and I was denied tenure at Princeton. And I faced what a good number of people in higher education faced. I faced potentially the end of my academic career at the moment of not getting promoted there. But I picked myself up like at the bottom of the apple tree. I got a non-tenured position at Pittsburgh, in the great city of Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh. I was able to continue my academic work, and things, all of my science started working, and my career got back on track again. But it's a reminder that life isn't predictable. Boy, has the last few weeks in Eastern Europe shown us that life isn't predictable. It can throw many challenges and bumps, as well as successes our way, and be ready for the sublime and the wonderful, but also be ready for the bumps and the failures, which do happen.
Thank you for reminding us about the bumps and the failures, because you're right. We all have those bumps and failures along the way. And I love that story about the apple tree. I climbed some trees in my past too, and didn't make it quite to the top either. So, and I always say, Andy, it's so funny about the intergenerational. I say, you know, we have the great opportunity of working with those 16-year-old, sometimes 14-year-old geniuses, and then the 80-year-olds. You're absolutely right. Thank you for that. So now I'd like to turn to your leadership praxis a little bit. And as an accomplished and a respected leader and change agent, and of course, during your presidency of NYU, we want to talk, and I talked a little bit in your bio, a little bit about some of the successes during your tenure. And so could you talk to us a little bit about what is the role of a leader to deliver success, and talk to us a little bit about your work?
That's an incredibly important question, and it's an incredibly profound question. It's quite a challenging question to answer, and I'll even take a step back, because it's important to remind ourselves what we are doing. We are at NYU. We love it. I hope we love it here for all the things that NYU does, all of the challenges, but the opportunities it presents to us. But let's just remember what NYU is. It's an institution that was founded in 1831. So we are what now? We are 9 years away from celebrating 200 years of NYU. Yeah, you mentioned I came from Oxford. Oxford was founded at the end of the 11th century. It's been nearly 900 years of existence, 200 years for NYU. And I think that reminds us that universities are very special places. And one of the things that's special about them is the diversity, of course, of their community, We'll come to that, I'm sure, later. But also the diversity of activity, you know, from chemistry to social science to medicine to law to social work, you know, to art, the incredible diversity. And that has also, over centuries, led to traditions, practices of governance in universities that is very important. And we very much embrace shared governance, the involvement of faculty and students in the governance of the university, and to some degree alumni in the role of our board of trustees. Why am I saying it's not a single person?
That's right. That's right.
NYU, great universities are not one person pushing forward their ideas. So it is, I view leadership very much as working in community. Yes, I have a job to try and chart a path, try and set a series of goals for us, becoming better, always improving. Universities always have room to improve. And I would also say for 200 years or 900 years, always changing, never standing still, never staying the same. And I think for me, part of the purpose of leadership within a university, being a president or a vice chancellor, is to help set the path for the university and to make progress towards that path, but bringing many, it'll never be everybody, but bringing many people with you. There is an element, of just having a broad vision, making NYU more affordable, making NYU commit to diversity, inclusion, and equity, making NYU a more sustainable, improving academic excellence in NYU, improving our links to and contribution to the city of New York. Those were all goals that I set when I arrived at NYU at the beginning of 2016, of priorities that I saw. But then the challenge of that I saw in my leadership is to then bring our community with us in the achievement of those goals. And if we can do that together, then NYU is much better for it. And also, if you can allow others to rightfully take credit for their work and their achievements, and not try to kind of muscle in and take credit. If you let people take credit for their own work, then it's amazing what you can achieve.
That is absolutely right. And that emphasis on shared governance is so important in higher education, which differentiates us from a lot of other sorts of industries,
Absolutely.
And I think that idea about making progress with through collaboration, right, is really, really key. And it actually leads me to my next question, because as you think about your career, and as I look at your record, you've always centered global inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, at least in the last couple of positions. And I even met some of your colleagues, as you know, from Oxford. So could you share with us a little bit about why that work is so important, not only just today, but even in the past, and thinking about that relationship to community, actually?
Yeah, well, again, Lisa, these are, we all come from our backgrounds, be they in those early years of our family and early schooling life. But for me, a very important reinforcement of why diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity matter has been my academic journey. And you touched upon it. I grew up in the UK, but I did my university education, in 3 different countries. I was in the UK, I went to Canada, and then came back to the UK for my PhD in Cambridge. But to someone who then worked at Oxford, Cambridge is like a foreign country. And then I went to France and I studied chemistry in a different language, in French. And it was remarkable to me in that experience of 3 different countries. And then I should say, I got my first job in a 4th, the US.
Right.
And I had a chance to really experience the impact of different cultures, different backgrounds, different ethnicities in the research teams that I was part of, and to see what incredible value that diversity brought. And, you know, Lisa, I would argue that diversity brought value to chemistry. You know, you might not expect that. You would have thought chemistry was a common language, a common science, and indeed, of course, it is. But the way you look at it, the way you approach a research problem, and as I mentioned, you know, to then do it in a different language in France, which I did for 2 years in the early 80s, gave you a very different perspective and a reinforcement of why diversity matters in science. And of course, it matters in the sociology of the groups, because science is not a solo subject. It advances because of group working and group communication and collaboration. And of course, you aren't just in the lab, you are in a city, in a country, in a very different country. And you begin to see the value of diversity for the wider university and the country itself. And so this was very much brought home to me through my background, as I said, in England, and then Canada, then back to England, then France, in the city of Strasbourg, which itself is on the French-German border, with really 2 languages playing out in the streets of Strasbourg, and then coming to the US, each of one with very different cultures, very different values inherent in the country. And I think that for me, it reinforced why diversity matters. The whole is strengthened massively by the diversity of the group that participates in it. And you asked me about my earlier roles. I'm very proud that as provost of Yale, I was involved with the then president in the first faculty diversity initiative, a major focus on and advancement, you know, real numbers, and putting forward a strategy, a plan, and then holding ourselves accountable for progress. And that was at Yale. And you mentioned it in Oxford, I created the first advocate for diversity. I think you met Rebecca Surrender, who a wonderful, wonderful leader in Oxford, and still playing an important role there. And the other thing that happened to me towards the end of my time in Oxford is that I'd been appointed the next president of NYU. I hadn't started. I think it was in October of 2015, but from Oxford, I watched a very important moment at NYU. You weren't here, Lisa, and I wasn't here, but I watched it from afar, and that was the town hall, the community gathering that took place in a building that doesn't actually exist anymore, and that's the Coles Gymnasium. And it was there to discuss diversity at NYU, but more importantly than that, even the experience of underrepresented groups in NYU in a real day-to-day lived experience. And it was a very searing few hours. It was a time of many individuals stepping forward to report their experiences at NYU. And it reinforced for this university, again, before I got here, before you got here, it reinforced that everything was not right at NYU. We had much work to do to improve our diversity, to improve our sense of belonging and welcome, and that not everyone at this university felt welcome. Not everyone had experiences that made them embrace and relish their time at NYU. And it was a very, very important moment, searing, traumatic, I think, for many, those listening and those talking. And for me, it helped me galvanize. It meant when I got here, the first thing I did, I got here on January the 1st, 2016. And I remember on day 2, I met with the recently appointed leaders of the diversity workforce. And that was the then dean of the Silver School, Lynn Videcker, and it was with Charlton McIlwain, who now is playing an important role at NYU. And it allowed me to look them both in the eye and say, this is an area that really matters to me, and I want us to make progress. And again, we're looking at metaphors. I've had the apple tree as a metaphor. Well, any of you who knew the Coles Gymnasium, it was a very ugly single-story building. Yes. And you know, NYU's DEI efforts, I won't say were ugly, but they weren't what they should be. And while they still are not where they should be, we still have much to do and work to do and improvements to make. We have made huge strides, and the 181 Mercer building isn't finished yet, and but it's a metaphor for the improvements that we have made. And one of the first recommendations of the task force, the working group, was that we needed to raise the priority of diversity, inclusion, and equity. We needed to hire a chief diversity officer who reported directly to the president to signal the importance of the area. And a certain Lisa Coleman came along, and we recruited. And more importantly than that, Lisa's arrival, the reorganization of our efforts in DEI led to a major set of investments, but also, you know, self-reflection. And to me, this has been really important. I'm a scientist, and I believe in data and using information, whether it's about science or whether it's about our community and what the experiences of people within the community. And of course, that led to the Being at NYU survey. And now we are working on the full interpretation and outcomes of that. But all along the way, the journey is almost as important as the outcome. You know, along the way, we're learning about ourselves. We're learning about where improvements need to be made. We're learning about new ways of thinking about faculty hiring, for example, and the cluster hiring initiative of one, Charlton McIlwain, is a very important part of that, as well as many other areas in student life and in the life of our employees at NYU as well. So, Lisa, long answer to an incredibly important question, but for me, I've been very pleased by the progress we've made, but I am also not at all complacent. We have much more progress to make, and that will be part of our commitment and challenge in the coming years as well.
Thank you so much for emphasizing the learning, the journey that we're taking together. And that's exactly right. It goes back to even some of the points you made in the first question about there's more progress to be made as institutions. That's part of the goal, right? The arc of higher education and learning. And we certainly have a lot of work to do, but I think we've made some great strides thus far. And this brings me back actually to the first part of the question where you were talking about your background and growing up and being and then finding yourself as a chemist. And in particular, as you were talking about this idea of bringing people together, right, in this sort of these collaborative spaces, whether they're the lab spaces, et cetera. So as much research demonstrates, and we know this from the work of people like Scott Page and Dolly Chugh and others, global inclusion, diversity, belonging, equity, and access work is related to innovation. It's actually related to how we create innovation. So could you talk to us a little bit about how innovation has played in your work, and in particular, thinking about that across the global landscape? Because we know, and you actually mentioned this earlier, we've got pandemics, fiscal downturns, hurricanes. I mean, no matter what happens, we're going to face it in higher ed, right? So how do we innovate, stay on top of those trends, and ensure that we're doing that through a sort of diverse perspective?
Lisa, I will come back to something I said earlier, which people often criticize universities for being, stuck in the mud, slow, unbelievably reluctant to change. That could not be further from the truth. I would argue the reason, tell me a company on the S&P 500 that's been in existence for 900 years. There isn't one.
Right.
The Catholic Church is just about the only institution that I know of that's been around longer than the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, and Oxford, the oldest universities in the Western world. And one of the reasons that universities have sustained is because I said earlier, they are constantly changing. We are constantly changing. I used to tease people in Oxford. They'd always say, why aren't you turning yourself into an online university? Why aren't you doing this with the internet? And I would say, hold it. Oxford was already 300 years old when the previous information revolution occurred. And it was called the printing press. And it was very bad if you happened to be a scribe,
right,
who had hand-wrote books.
That's right.
It was very bad for your job prospects. But universities haven't done badly in embracing the book and incorporating it into their methods of pedagogy, their methods of scholarship. And we are doing pretty well with the internet and online resources and the digital world. We aren't turning ourselves inside out. We're not blowing up all of our physical buildings, because that's not what we do. And I know I'll come back to innovation, but you touched on the pandemic, Lisa. And as we have this Zoom conversation, boy, would I much rather be in your office having this, and I think all of us have realized something truly fundamental in human interaction is that we need to see each other. We need to be in the presence of each other. Of course, online is wonderful, and one can do a huge amount of one's life, but the relationship between a teacher and a student, there is a very special thing for that in-person connection. So innovation, you asked me innovation, and again, the fundamental mission of a university, the fundamental mission of NYU, is the creation and the dissemination of knowledge. And that first one, the creation of knowledge, is fundamental. It means that we discover things. And it's not just discovering a new subatomic particle. It's not just discovering a new species of beetle. It's discovering fundamental elements of the human condition, of what it means to be alive, what it means to die, what it means to love, all of the things that are to be human, that is in the world of literature and poetry. And universities cross such wide swathes of the intellectual landscape. But the one thing they are always doing, and this is what the definition of research, you're going somewhere no one has ever been before. We used to think about adventure and exploration being those who went into uncharted territories. Well, in the life of the mind, the life that we are all at NYU committed to, in the life of the mind, uncharted territories are where no one has been before, whether it's a chemical reaction that's never been demonstrated or analyzed before, whether it's a new interpretation of Voltaire's writings. Each of these is taking human thought and human knowledge into places that it's never been before. We overpraise ourselves in each generation for being the unique, the most innovative generation. Innovation is part of university's core mission. And again, the dissemination of new knowledge. And why do I say this? It's because, you know, innovation is built into what we do. And, you know, that business about being stuck in the mud. Look at NYU, look at every university, and the speed with which we changed in March 2020, being hit by a pandemic that we had no idea was going to hit us. And you commented, we never know what's around the corner. That's the nature of humanity. It's the nature of existence on this earth. There are some things we do know, climate change, you know, that's coming at us pretty fast. We don't quite know what form it'll take. We don't quite know what impact it'll have. So there are some things we can prepare for. Perhaps we should have done a better job preparing for a pandemic. But when I imagined a pandemic, I imagined, you know, the gymnasium filled with, you know, cots for people to sleep on. I haven't seen a single one of those for the last 2 years. I'm certainly not at NYU. We're all in our rooms, you know, with our iPhones and our iPads, you know, in lockdown. Yeah. And so I do think that the inherent innovation that's inside all of us, but in the inherent innovation that is at the core of universities and NYU by the very nature of the work we do, which is to explore new areas of the human mind and how it interprets the world around it. I think this then allows us to be innovative as we tackle challenges of becoming a better institution, of becoming a more diverse and inclusive institution. And so for me, that becomes a key part of encouraging everyone, you know, from the first year student to the, you know, emeritus faculty member who's seen everything and done it all. Each one has a contribution to make to helping the institution advance, but also being innovative in doing that.
Thank you for talking about innovation. I agree. Sometimes we like to pat ourselves on the back a little too much because we think we've created everything. Exactly. So, but I really appreciate that, and talking about the arc of innovation and the diverse disciplines, the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work from poetry to chemistry. So I can't believe we're at the end of our conversation. And so this is a question that we really want, because we have so many emerging leaders out there. And I'm glad you shared the arc of your journey, because you didn't wake up a leader, right? So you went through a process. And so the last thing we like to ask is, as we think about the complex world in which we all exist, we're all, you know, doing these leadership journeys as leaders. Tell us a little bit about what sustains you, what gives you joy, right? I mean, right, because sometimes I can imagine people are looking at you and they're like, he was born a leader. That's all he does, 24 hours a day, right? So tell us.
So I had no intention of becoming a university president, none whatsoever. I never intended to be anywhere other than the lab, you know, even in my professional life. So this is something that just kind of happened, as does often. You know, I'll come back to the apple tree. You know, one day, and it happened to be at Yale, and one day somebody in a high position at Yale came to me and said, Andy, you know, would you consider, and for me, it was becoming deputy provost. That was my first step on the ladder. And it was just recognizing, hey, this is something that isn't that different from running a chemistry lab, you know, that bringing people together around a common purpose. And you asked me what gives me joy, Lisa, you know, other than the Steelers winning the Super Bowl, that goes without saying. But
we know your deep love of Pittsburgh and the
Steelers. I think for me, without question, the greatest joy I get professionally is from watching my students. I've had a research group, and in my prime, I had a large research group, 30 odd people, and I've had something near close to 200 students and postdocs spend time, do their PhDs or do research in my lab. And it's watching them grow intellectually and scientifically, watching them evolve, watching them leave and go and establish their own programs, whether it's at a university or in industry or starting up a company or going, I've had some go into law and patent law and things of that kind. And it's watching my students in my research life. And then as president, my wife Jenny and I love nothing more than going to student performances. Tish Steinhardt, we've been to a couple of Gallatin performances over the years, and again, seeing the talent of our students and the great joy and satisfaction that they get from expressing that talent, whether it's in dance, whether it's in music, whether it's in theater, drama, whether it's in athletics. We often go to basketball, volleyball, other athletic events. On a personal level, that was professional. On a personal level, Jenny and I love to walk. We love to walk in the mountains, the hills. There aren't too many mountains and hills in Manhattan. I haven't, there are hills, I have to say. Hills. But walking the streets of New York and just exploring new parts of this amazing city. And then, the pandemic has been very difficult and challenging for all of us. But for Jenny and me on a personal level, the pandemic has actually brought us joy. We have 4 new grandchildren who were all born during the pandemic. We had one already who turned 4 a couple of days ago, and we have 4 other grandchildren, all under the age of 2, all COVID children. And of course, now we have the inestimable joy of watching our grandchildren grow and being able to spoil them rotten, to know that their parents are the ones who are going to have to deal with all the discipline issues. We can just enjoy them.
Oh, that's terrific. That's just absolutely terrific. And thank you again for sharing your journey, for sharing your joys, for sharing some of the things that have even been challenging. And so appreciative. Thank you so much for joining us today, President Hamilton.
Lisa, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take
to
care.
Our emerging leaders out there, we hope you continue to take good care, and we hope that you will follow the Office of Global Inclusion for more transformation talks, as well as updates about our events, programs, and of course, resources. Please continue to follow us and partner with us in our efforts to advance institutional excellence across global diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and access. Thank you again, and take good care.